Bitches, welcome to this another Buds on Film podcast. I am Scott Morris and I'm joined today by Drew Tavendale.
Greetings.
Right.
I nodded my head because, of course, it works so well on radio.
Yes.
We are indeed Fuds. Well, I certainly am.
We're missing Craig, who's currently in transit and can't be with us, but sure he won't mind us cracking on without him as we talk about some of our favourite superheroes, Batman and Superman. We're going to basically give you the rundown on all of them. Well, I say all of them, all of the live-action film, because if we talk about the entire range of adaptations of Batman and Superman from the comics, then we'd be here forever. We're not going to be talking about some, even though there are some very good animated series and animated feature-length films, we won't be talking about any of those. We may touch mildly on some of the television stuff, but we don't intend to cover that particularly here either. The series has gone all the way back from radio productions to some very early television shows indeed, one of which was the subject of 2006 Hollywoodland in a way, as it was a film focusing on George Reeves, who was the first incarnation of Superman to be seen on the screen. George Reeves in that case played by Ben Affleck, who of course is currently lighting up cinemas in Batman Vs Supermen, which was essentially the reason why we're doing this podcast at all. So there's an interesting little bit of pub trivia for you, someone who has kind of technically, if you squint at it, played Superman and Batman. We're just going to crack straight on. We're doing this more or less chronologically, and if you're going chronologically, the first feature film that I'm aware of comes from all the way back in 1966, where we talk about the Adam West Batman version. And I suppose, if nothing else, it gives us an opportunity to recognise how very much this franchise has changed over the years.
Just a little.
Yeah.
It's got an ever so slightly different tone now as then.
Yeah, so the 66 outing is very much rooted in golden era silliness. It takes a very tongue-in-cheek take on the material for a camp comic effect. Although, now I say that, I was saying tongue-in-cheek compared to what Batman is today. I suppose at the time it might actually have been capturing the tone relatively well. But yes, certainly lots of silly comic stuff going on here, including the now thoroughly beamed shark repellent spray. The plot, I don't think we need to concern ourselves too much. You have Catman, Penguin and the Joker and the Riddler all teaming up to dehydrate an analogue of the United Nations Security Council, which really just gives them a chance to run through their trademark shtick before Adam West vanquishes them, along with, of course, the boy wonder, Burt Ward. I must say I rather prefer these kind of Batman things in TV episodes length if I must watch them. The joke wears a little thin by the end of this film's running time, but it's done with such good nature that you'd have to be a right old grumpy person to really take much issue with it. It's harmless, paper-thin fun, but it's very much a footnote to the rest of the films, to what we will be speaking of and that.
Yeah, and the Batman feature-length film from 1966, it was just an extended episode, really. There wasn't even a great change in production value or anything. Not massively, anyway. And yeah, it's just like a longer episode. And they are, like most of those episodes, they were daft fun, very much made for a different time, or maybe a less cynical age.
Yeah.
I know it was in the middle of the Cold War, but the 60s and free love and come up in the space race and stuff, there was a different vibe going on, I think, which had changed in the United States after Vietnam, but pre-Vietnam, it was a different time. And it's not something that holds up particularly well now, I feel.
No.
I don't have a lot of patience for any of these. I've tried watching a couple of episodes a few years ago.
It's the sort of thing, I like reading recaps of them more than I like actually watching them themselves. It's when you hear schemes like one of the Joker's plans was to turn all of Gotham City's water supply to jelly. And apparently somehow gain money or something from that. But of course it was foiled, and I think Batman shouldn't have foiled that one. I think that would have been quite a laugh.
Yeah, that's less harmful than, for instance, wanting to do things to the water supply in, for instance, Batman Begins.
Yes.
It's much less sinister, altogether lighter in tone. And I think it's one of the clearest differences is just how silly they are, really, whether that was conscious or not, where everything since, really, particularly since the Tim Burton one, even though there's a distinct cartoonish look about the Tim Burton Batman, everything from then on was so much grimmer and darker and more self-serious. And in the Adam West film, it's like they were aware of this thing called colour that has largely been forgotten by now.
Yeah.
Now, I think they were a bit too fond of colour because largely try to use every colour in existence at the same time on the screen all at once. And it's a visual nightmare sometimes, but it's so much lighter and almost to the point where you could think it wasn't the same character at all.
Yeah.
But it feels kind of odd lumping that film in with these other ones, because there's a similarity in tone. Maybe, for instance, Superman's are a little lighter, but similarity in tone with a lot of the the films we're going to talk about subsequently. And this one, it stands out. It's like a sore thumb. It's so different from these others.
Yeah, like you say, there's a bit of this showing up in, for example, Superman 3, but not to this extent. At no point is Superman running around with a giant sort of cartoonish bomb trying to dispose of it in places and coming across increasingly bizarre places of vulnerable people that he cannot possibly throw his bomb at. It's just very strange.
More's the pity, to be honest, given that Superman 3 and particularly Superman 4 could possibly have done with that.
Yes.
But it's one that's worth talking about because it exists and it's the first big screen adaptation of Batman, but it's almost a different character.
It's almost a different world, different universe even.
Yes. Although, what I do have to remember is that obviously Adam West is the best Batman ever and he's not going to let you forget it. A tip to anybody who's ever watching any program that has Adam West as a talking head, unless you want to hear Adam West go into length about how brilliant he was, don't watch it. Okay, so from the first big screen outing of Batman, we come to the first big screen outing of really the archetypal comic book hero, the real original Superman, who been on TV with George Reeves, as we mentioned, brought to the big screen in 1978 by Richard Donner. Now, perhaps it's the first really great comic to film translation. There's a 1970s Spider-Man movie, which is best forgotten, and a few other efforts before that. Around about that time, we had the Incredible Hulk on TV at least, and they all felt a bit silly. They were all really more in the vein of Batman, Adam West one, rather than any of these films we're going to talk about. Richard Donner's film gives us Marlon Brando sending his only son from the doomed planet Krypton to Earth, where he'll have superpowers that I would imagine everybody's pretty familiar with. And really, if you don't know what Superman can do, I assume you've been living under a rock and should probably just concern yourself with getting some sunlight first of all, and not listening to this podcast. But they do vary a bit depending on the needs of the various film plots. But quick backstory of Superman, just to briefly cover it to make sure you are aware. He grows up in a small Midwest town after he's found as a baby after being sent to Earth by his dad, heads off to Metropolis in his cover identity of Clark Kent to join the Daily Planet as a mild-mannered, bumbling reporter, and then unveils himself to the world as a defender of truth, justice and the American way. And then his most difficult task in the film is to deal with the self-proclaimed criminal mastermind of Lex Luthor and his plan to drop most of the western coast into the sea to increase the value of his soon-to-be coastal properties, trying to turn desert into beachfront, which is a suitably comic book villain scale thing to do, although it being more than one Superman film based on the idea of real estate seems such a strange thing. The fact there's even one of them is an odd one. It almost doesn't fit with the grandeur of the idea of Superman, but it's helps that it is played by such a good actor. We don't get to that till quite late in the film, unfortunately, so it's a bit of a waste of Gene Hackman's talents, but Gene Hackman's always watchable. However, the rest of the film stands up pretty well to this day, and actually, because of it's like, the front projection system that you'll believe a man can fly. Watching that again, though, it's not awful by any means. It was cutting edge in the day. Okay, on high def, you can see that it's a blue screen, but to be honest, some of the CGI efforts of even 10 years ago don't look as good as this does now. Yeah, so it still cuts a fairly believable flying effect because of attention to detail and the physical components, the wind through capes and dresses and stuff. But yes, it's the reason that this is so fondly remembered is that Christopher Reeve was great in the role. Casting that worked really well. The tall, handsome man who managed to convey both like the bumbling reporter and the true identity of Superman. The whole idea of nobody recognising Clark Kent was always silly, but the fact that he's playing these as two different characters, playing them well, works very well. Chemistry with Margot Kidder's Lois Lane worked well. And you watch Reeves shrinking from the bold Superman to the timid Clark. It is a joy to behold. And again, it's a stretch because see this man who looks exactly like Superman. He's definitely not Superman, right? No. Okay then. But it's just he brushes his hair differently. It's just a pair of glasses. But he is just such a likeable guy in the film, and he's great to watch. He just captures your attention, and it's what makes Superman possibly, although I think maybe I would argue for Superman 2 actually, the high watermark for Superman on film. And it's actually about 2.5 hours, I think, Superman Scott, isn't it? And a good hour of its origin story.
Yeah.
And actually, the origin story in Superman is really interesting. It gets a bit much because nowadays you feel like every second superhero film starts with an origin story again.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to have about the 18th Spider-Man by in a couple of years' time, I think. But the one in Superman actually still pretty entertaining, even if it does have a fairly lengthy section of Marlon Brando chewing the scenery.
Yeah.
It being crystal scenery isn't going to do wonders for his teeth. It was a real classic. I mean, it had John Williams' score, which I'm not going to say is particularly memorable because I think me and Colin with about 90% of the planet at some point starts humming the Superman march and it turns into Star Wars halfway through. But it's still, year after Star Wars, John Williams, fairly memorable score, good scope, special effects that at the time were great, still don't look awful today. A really great central character, so it was a really good way to bring Superman to the big screen.
Yeah, I would argue if you judge this against any other film that has special effects as some kind of fairly core mechanic of it, I'd say Superman holds up better than almost all of them. It does look pretty good, as I say, just got little touches of attention to detail that you could do with physical effects. And yeah, surely the projection's a bit ropey these days, but it's not so bad. It's still perfectly believable. And as we say, just some really great performances. A lot of great chemistry between Lois Lane, Mark Kidder, his character, and Reeve himself as Superman and Clark. Some really good kind of play from those two characters in two different, with three different characters, if you like, as somewhat different relationship between Lois and Clark and Lois and Superman, and they capture that very well, I thought, and I really do like watching Reeve kind of bounce between the two roles. It does. When he's doing it, I do almost believe that you might not notice that it's just the only difference is a pair of glasses and the location of the underpants. Yeah, I like it an awful lot. I think it's still perhaps Superman's best film.
No,
yes.
As I said, I don't think I would argue, and we'll come on to that very shortly, I would argue that Superman 2 is, for me, a more entertaining film. It does have the issues of there have been two very different versions of it because of the saga of making it. But the second one had Terrence Stamp as General Zod, and for me, that seals the deal.
Yeah.
But Superman, it's very entertaining. The only genuine issue I have with it is it just, apart from it being a bit to estate agent based, really, is the rewinding of time.
Yeah. That
never sat well with me. It always seemed a step too far. What can we do? Superman's great Deus Ex Machina. If we spin the planet backwards, time will reverse. And never comfortable
quite sure
with
that works out, yeah.
No, but it's, other than that, deeply entertaining film. It stands up better than most other superhero films. It's certainly nearly 30 years later. Special effects still passable, still entertaining. And importantly, performance by Reeve is still great, still very watchable. As I've mentioned it quite a few times now, I think it's time to just move on to the second Superman film, which came just 2 years later in 1980. Now, it had a confusing and controversial production history that might indeed warrant a podcast all by itself. Richard Donner, director of Superman the movie, is replaced by Richard Lester in the director's chair, except sort of wasn't replaced. It's very complicated because some of it's actually directed by Richard Donner, and it's Hollywood politics. They're not really much fun, especially when they tend to ruin films.
Yeah.
So Richard Lester comes in, restarts a production originally designed to be shot simultaneously with the original. It's obviously quite closely tied into the first film, as a stray nuclear blast releases the three Kryptonian rebels imprisoned at the film's start, who head off to cause havoc on Earth, headed by the legendary Terrence Stamp's General Zod, and that's a truly iconic role.
Before whom you should kneel.
Yes. Meanwhile, you have Lois Lane, who has figured out Clark's big secret because she's the only person in the world who's got a proper prescription for glasses or something, I think. And the two have become romantically involved, leading to Superman giving up on his superpowers in order to live a normal, happy, mortal life with Lois. Just as General Zod pops up in the White House and proclaims himself ruler of the world. Gene Hackman also returns, with Lex Luthor having escaped prison and figured out the location of Superman's Fortress of Solitude. And with him being more than willing to share that information to ingratiate himself with the new overlords with the questionable fashion sense. Now, Richard Lester takes a somewhat lighter tone than Richard Donner did in the first film, with a little more slapstick working its way into proceedings. Whether that's to the film's detriment or not, I think, Scott, that you think not necessarily. I am not sure, but it's not in danger of becoming like an Adam Sandler film or anything like that. So
No.
it's not something that's particularly ruining it. It remains an enjoyable and good-natured entry into the series that, well, for me, better than the predecessor, particularly the director's cut. Richard Donner's cut of it, actually, I prefer. But they're both very good. It's a shame, though, I really like the somewhat fractured nature or largely messed up nature of the production led to a few continuity snags and scenes that don't flow quite as well as the original. It's very much worth watching. Another one that holds up well. Again, I think less because of the effects, and even the story is not fantastic in either of these two films, but it's the performances, because Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve continue to be very, very watchable. Gene Hackman it's not the best role he's ever had by any stretch, but he's Gene Hackman. You could watch him all day. And then you add to that the amazing Terence Stamp. General Zod is one of the great comic book villains, and I don't think he gets the credit he deserves for just how awesome Terence Stamp is, isn't it? So it's those things, particularly performances, that just make it stand up so well. Quarter of a century later.
Yeah, like I say, all the memorable scenes in this film are Zod related. Not to disparage the rest of the stuff, but Reeve's still great, Margot Kidder's still great, but Terence Stamp really does just kind of run away with all the actual charisma in this film, and is just him getting to grips with Earth and his new superpowers and all these kind of things. Lots of nice little scenes that are, they're a bit slapstick, but I think most of them kind of work as being reasonably funny and dialed back enough that it just kind of lightens the tone a little bit without necessarily screwing everything else up, which we'll get onto in a bit later. As I gotta say, for my money, it's almost as good as the original. I'm sure I've seen the Richard Donner cut at some point, but I couldn't find it when I was rewatching for this, so I was stuck with the original DVD release from some time ago, which was the unholy Donner-Lester hybrid, which it's still okay. It's still pretty decent. That's what I base my opinions on, but yeah, you can tell it's very obvious scenes where they have to have a stand-in for guys like Gene Hackman, who would not come back to reshoot anything under Lester's role, and I think Margot Kidder was the same. So there's some very strange continuity glitches going on through it, but it doesn't really distract from how good the film is.
You can see where they've papered over the cracks, but they've at least done a decent job of papering.
Yeah, but if you can get a hold of the Donner cut, that's probably the way to go. So it took 3 years for the next film to pop out, but with Superman 2 performing pretty well at the box office, there was presumably very little resistance to Lester returning to direct another outing that does take a much more broadly comic tone, slapstick from the outset with a pretty execrable title sequence loaded with buffoonery, but this time Superman's dealing with monopolistic business tycoon Ross Webster, played by Robert Vaughn, and he's leaning on computer savant Gus, played by Richard Pryor, to boost his business with schemes such as hacking into computers, controlling a weather satellite, and using it to affect cops in Colombia, displaying a worrying difference to both how computers and weather satellites work. Weather satellites don't create weather. That is not how it works. Once it's clear that Superman's able to stop their ploys with some ease, they concoct some artificial, almost kryptonite that doesn't kill Superman as they intend, but instead turns him into a super douchebag. This leads to a systemically puzzling, but nonetheless pretty awesome good Clark versus evil Superman fight, a concept shamelessly reprised in Fight Club. That is, however, along with Reeves' continued great portrayal of Superman's good and bad, pretty much the only awesome thing in the film. I can't quite get on board the hate train commonly ascribed to this film, but it's certainly got its negatives. Gene Hackman, not returning due to his fallout with the producers over their treatment of Richard Donner, didn't return for the film, and this could have been treated as an opportunity to do something different with an enemy, but instead you get a pale imitation of Lex Luthor. Somewhat more successfully, Margot Kidder, who also was reduced to a cameo role, allows old childhood flame Lana Lane, played by Annette O'Toole, to take over the love interest duty, which is a good idea but falls a bit flat in execution. The chemistry isn't really there, certainly nothing like on the level with Kidder and Reeve. So most of the heavy lifting to keep this film entertaining has actually been left to Richard Pryor, who does the best I can imagine anyone doing with this material, but it's really not anywhere near good enough to hang with the previous two installments. Still, with the benefit of hindsight, it's tough to be too dismissive of Superman 3 given what will follow, but it's certainly nothing that we can recommend.
Yes, I'm thinking too that when you were talking about you can't quite get on board with the hate train, and I can't. It's somewhere between a a bad and mediocre film. But when Superman 4 exists, really you're able to save your hate for where it belongs.
Yeah, there's a certain baseline, and this is not it. And I do remember it's one of the few films as a kid that actually scared me. You know, there's always like people have like strange things they've glimpsed in some film that's freaked them out. And the one thing that got me in this one, which looks absolutely laughable today, is towards the end when Ross Webster's sister gets kind of captured by that computer and turned into a sort of cyborg, which looks like the most ludicrously cheap effect that you could see now, but for some reason just absolutely freaked me out as a kid, and it was one of the few scary things in it. But strange to think what you look back on and see what your foolish kid mind was doing. But between that and there's one sort of vaguely memorable exchange between Pryor and Vaughn about socks, which is also there. But yeah, other than that, there's not an awful lot to really like in Superman 3. I don't think it is the worst film. It's certainly not the worst film we'll talk about in this outing, but yeah, it's not all that far off it, and we certainly can't really recommend this to anyone.
No, I think I don't have any vitriol for Superman 3. It's just one of your bog standard bad films. For me, it's more forgettable than anything else. I mean, I don't know, maybe I liked it more as a kid, or just that I happened to have the poster. But I do remember having a poster on the wall of the computer and the machine that they use in the cave. It's just a bit poor. I don't remember it particularly well, so a few years since I've seen this one now. But it's just a bit poor. It suffers clearly from losing cast members, and I don't particularly rate Richard Lester as a director. Now, apparently one of the issues Richard Donner had was he thought that Richard Lester, particularly in the second film, was a bit too fond of comedy, which is strange from the man that brought us the Lethal Weapon series, but okay. And I think Superman 3 is on the verge of getting a wee bit to 1966 Batman, actually.
There's some really silly bits with like Richard Pryor having a little accident with skis when he goes the wrong way off the Richard Vaughn's rooftop ski slope, which he has for some reason, and skis down the side of a building and somehow lands perfectly fine. Come on.
I mean, it's got issues like that. For the most part, though, it's like, it's a bit rubbish, and then don't think about it beyond that. Whereas, yes, there are other places you want to really direct your anger.
Yes, speaking of which, another few years down the line, in 1987 brought us Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. With the Salkinds figuring that the Superman thing had kind of run its course, production duties fell to another party. Golan Globus, 2 words guaranteed to strike fear into the hearts of anyone old enough to remember trawling through Blockbuster Video. They did, to be fair to them, take a few risks by filming things like operas and such like, but in the main, their legacy composes of such grade A clunkers as Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo, the American Ninja franchise, Life Force, He-Man, Master of the Universe, and of course, Superman 4, a joyless, wildly underwritten film that I can absolutely get on board the hate train for. After mulling it over, Superman decides that nuclear weapons are intolerable and starts rounding them up and launching them into the sun for disposal. However, this plays into Lex Luthor's newest plan to enhance his arms dealing business by creating a compliant, superpowered nuclear man, played by Mark Pillow, who's tasked with destroying Superman via some highly questionable science that the franchise seems so fond of. They fight, and Superman wins. Sorry, spoilers. Somehow this meagre fare stretches out to an hour and a half. Margot Kidder and Gene Hackman return, so on a superficial level at least, this looks like a Superman film, but the grunting one-note nuclear man is as uninspired and boring an antagonist as could be imagined. And he's also clearly solar-powered, not nuclear-powered, so grossly misnamed. Just when you think you'd have remembered everything bad about this film, you remember that doofus from 2.5 Men was in this, which at least proves that he's never been funny. This film deserves the same fate Superman bestows upon the nukes he hated so much, launch it into the sun and divert your eyes from it. I guess I can see where they're going with this. One of the problems with Superman is being that he is essentially immortal, and how are you going to beat him? And so the concept of having another superpowered villain to kind of beat him up, just again going back to the Superman 2 thing, I kind of see why they were doing it, but it's just so cack-handedly done with what has to be about 1/10 of the budget of the original Superman film and about 1/10 of the talent going into the writing and execution of it. It is just an absolute horror show of things. Really, really terrible. Even Reeve apparently was taking no actors aside at the start of this film and telling them, look, this is going to be terrible, just so they knew they weren't going to get their hopes up. But there's not really anything at all to recommend in this. Stephen Reeves kind of doing it by the numbers by this point. It also didn't do particularly well. Reeve kind of blames it for really putting the halts on his career at that point. It was a bit of a bomb, and it did deserve to bomb. It's not very good at all. Certainly no one involves high watermark, and something that's best left forgotten.
I think so. I never saw this when it was new, and I've only seen it once, and I saw it for the first time when for some reason I watched all the Superman films again a few years ago, and I just sort of slack-jawed at just how awful this was.
Yeah.
Nuclear Man has so little charisma, he could well have been played by Dennis Quaid. And the story is paper thin. The acting is, what's the word really?
Fish?
Yeah, but it's more to do with like why, because it's just so uninspiring. So there's nothing for the actors to get their teeth into at all. It's so underwhelming in every possible way. It's just a genuinely bad film. It's badly written, if they bothered writing it at all. I think you could argue that no, they didn't. Imagine like, the premise of the film could be summed up basically in one sentence. It's as much as they wrote, and somehow they got funding for it.
Yeah.
It's bad performances, complete lack of story, complete lack of charisma, no peril, nobody really cares. It is a bad film, and I think we should stop talking about it now.
Yeah. Apparently they left about an hour of it on the cutting room floor. There was going to be like another Nuclear Man that was done before it, but kind of Superman bit quite easily, so they made another one, which was the one you see on screen, and dear Lord, why would anyone write or shoot any more of this film? Dear Lord.
Why couldn't they have left all of it on the cutting room floor where it belongs?
Yeah. Most appropriate.
So I think we're done with Superman for a little while now. We're going to move on to Batman. 23 years after Adam West brought him to the big screen, he was brought back by the much more distinctive, if not to everybody's taste, talents of Tim Burton. Now, this is a much darker film. While it's cartoonish and it's still full of bright colours, it somehow still feels in every way much darker than the 1960s version. Maybe we should start though by recognising the phenomena that Tim Burton's adaptation starring Michael Keaton was back in the dying days of the 80s. And Batman and all the money and the toys and ways of getting you to hand over your hard-earned pounds were everywhere, handled with the sort of fervour you'd expect of a Star Wars release. Coming within a decade or so of Star Wars really realising how much you could milk merchandising for. It was described as a dark gothic take on the subject matter, reflecting the changed tone of the comics it's sourced from. It's only really the case when compared it to the Adam West version to the 1960s, because yes, it's still very comic book looking. It's pretty campy in so many. I mean, Jack Nicholson, entertaining as he is, does dance about a bit like Cesar Romero. There are definitely similarities there. So rather than dive straight into Batman's origin story though, it's quite cleverly weaved in throughout the film with an origin story of the Joker, memorably played, of course, as just mentioned, by Jack Nicholson. As he's betrayed by the crime boss he ultimately usurps before unleashing a deadly poison-backed wave of fear across Gotham. That means you can get straight to the bat action, although it's rather bat-dated by this point, in particular the bat suit. And it still looks quite good, but clearly there's no range of motion at all, because in many of the scenes, Michael Keaton looks like a statue.
Yeah.
He can't move. So it does lead to a lot of fight scenes of people running into Michael Keaton's fist, because it's about the only thing they could do. It's like a posable action figure rather than a man. Now, the production design is, it's pretty amazing. It's very distinctive. It's very Tim Burton. And whether you like Tim Burton or not, I happen to, for the most part, like him, but his style, generally very, very distinctive, and that really helps here. It's Tim Burton's Gotham is a very distinctive place. You know, kind of sleazy 1920s, 1930s New York aesthetic. You know, it's never been more atmospheric. Although, it's nowadays, if you try to watch it again on a high definition television, it does look a bit shoddy. Michael Keaton is okay as Batman. I've never been a great fan of it, although, well, I will say when I watched this again a few years ago too, I hated it. Right. I really hated this film. Well, maybe hate's a little strong. It was so distinctive, but for some reason, it just never worked for me. And Jack Nicholson is entertaining because he's Jack Nicholson, but I just never really liked this take on Batman. Now, and Michael Keaton's fairly entertaining, and he does one of the better jobs of feeling different as Batman and Bruce Wayne. Jack Nicholson's entertaining to say. Kim Basinger is Vicky Vett. She could more or less be left out of the film entirely. She does much of use in this. Yeah, it's got a distinctive look, and so it has merit in those cases. It's a film that clearly maybe you don't like it, but you can see that it has a style. It's got a character and a presence, unlike, for instance, Superman 4. But for me, I just don't like Batman. I just found it a bit boring.
Yeah, I still find enjoyment from it, but as you say, it's essentially the Jack Nicholson show, isn't it? It's all revolving around his gurning. The Batman, I do really like the way that it's structured and the way that it doesn't have to bludgeon you with an origin story, and it can really just sort of tell that over the course of the film rather than having to front load all of it. And I think that actually does lend a bit of intrigue to it, which otherwise it doesn't have. The story itself, the main plot, once you get into it, is pretty straightforward, and the action scenes don't cut it anymore. They really don't. Even like the driving scenes, which are better than the fight scenes, given the limitations we spoke of earlier, but they're still not all that great. I've always found something a bit strange about this. The Burton era of Batman doesn't seem to really care so much about the whole not killing people and aspects of his persona, which has become such a central part of what happens later on. And it's not so much that he's actually shooting people, but certainly people will go flying off buildings and he won't be that bothered about trying to save them or anything like that.
I actually think, sorry Scott, just to interrupt you a bit, because I think exactly what you're talking about just now is one of the reasons that I dislike it, because having come back to this after like the Nolan era, I haven't not seen it in so many years. Although you could quite easily argue that the Nolan films have like weapons and stuff, and I'm not that caring as much perhaps as he claims to about not hurting people. In this Tim Burton Batman, at some point, like the Batwing, this may be Batman Returns, but I think this one, the Batwing is firing machine guns. That's not how Batman's supposed to be, and it's a wee bits like that contributed to me not liking it, I think. That's maybe a sort of a conversation for people who are more familiar with the comic books than I am, though.
Yeah, that's the one thing that strikes me across all these Burton era films, where it doesn't really seem to have much of it doesn't care much about Batman as a character. The way that the Nolan eras kind of fixate on how he's becoming the Mask and all that stuff that we'll get onto later on. This film, he is just a man who fights evil and has cool toys and a silly outfit that wouldn't really be able to bend over and get into that Batmobile in the first instance. But yeah, so it certainly, in terms of what came later, a very simplistic take on it. I still find there to be some joy in there, but yeah, it's definitely overshadowed by a lot of things. I feel it's worth watching, but it's mid-table in the kind of things we were talking about today.
I think where it wins is it has a distinctive character, whereas look at like Superman the movie. What was distinctive about that is the acting, the character of Superman. What's distinctive about Tim Burton's Batman is like the actual character of the movie, and the Gotham is. And if you really dig that aesthetic, then I think you're going to get a lot out of that film. Yeah. And it's so that it's memorable from that point of view. It's just that what happens in that setting, I don't find particularly successful. Yeah. Okay. Now, Batman was pretty successful. Certainly successful enough for Warner Brothers to get Burton and Keaton back 3 years later. And with the primary villain in this installment being Danny DeVito's quite memorable Penguin. It's a somewhat bizarre take on the character, because what they decided, rather than it just being like someone who dressed in such a way had a passing resemblance to a penguin, it's sort of like somewhere between Dr. Moreau and Tarzan of the Apes of penguins, with the character seemingly able to actually communicate and command penguins, because why not? I mean, actual penguins, not robot penguins, actual penguins who are living in a sewer for some reason. I don't know whether that was like based on that urban legend of alligators in New York sewers or something, but with a more comic animal. But yes, and there also seems to be a strong suggestion that, that's why I mentioned Dr. Moreau, that somehow the penguin is actually part bird. Why not? Anyway, after a life of living in the sewers, he hatches a plan, possibly from an egg he laid himself, being part penguin. Along with his gang of circus goons, he wants to blackmail the rather shady business tycoon Max Schreck, the ever-watchable Christopher Walken, into helping him return to society. Which is strange because he was never really part of society, but there we go. Meanwhile, Max Schreck's attempted murder of his doormat of a secretary who digs a little too deep into his plans gives rise to Michelle Pfeiffer's split personality Catwoman. an acrobatic loose cannon who has her own agenda, and while it retains the strong sense of production design in terms of the set and characters, the plot can't really survive the final act deployment of a literal penguin army. I don't know though, actually, the idea of a literal penguin army amuses me greatly, far more than the film managed to do. But perhaps the most surprising thing about the script is the volume of double entendres, single entendres perhaps. It's weird, though, by today's standards, how cartoony everything is around it, to see those rather crass adult moments shoehorned in. Now, it's definitely a step down from its predecessor, because when I said maybe I hated Batman, I don't. I hate Batman Returns, though, because the last time I watched it, I was just genuinely so bored by it. It's like, maybe I used the word hate too easily, it's perhaps not appropriate, but it's got this really strong aesthetic and just never for me really uses it. It's got Christopher Walken, who really maybe just should be playing Max Zorin in this film.
Yeah.
I kind of think that's what they wanted. It feels like that at times, and I think it might be more entertaining if it was Max Zorin. It might have saved the film a little. Catwoman, it's just, I don't know, I don't really get her. I know she's a bit sort of affected by the attempted murder, so maybe character motivation is not quite the right way to put it, but character doesn't feel that good. The penguin's an actual penguin. And it's another spurned opportunity because it has such a strong aesthetic, and Michael Keaton perfectly watchable. And it's just that, I don't know, had it actually gone stronger, whole in on the whole film on a penguin army, I might have, for entirely the wrong reasons, really have enjoyed this film. But it's, a step down from Batman, which is tolerable. It's pretty bores me. Scarily, though, for a film that I'm considering using the word hate towards, much, much better than what followed it.
Yes. By no means the low tide of the franchise. No. I have some grudging respect for Batman Returns. It's mainly because I still think it looks really nice in the same way that Batman does. I just really like that, as you say, I really dig that aesthetic. I like the way these films look, which will soon become ruined. But yeah, there's an awful lot of things in Batman Returns that I cannot get behind. And largely it's the Penguin, how he looks, what he is, and how he acts. All of it. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand why this is in the film, and I certainly don't understand why a lot of people seem to really like Batman Returns and think that it's better than the first one, and those people are on crack. I cannot for the life of me see what is better in this film than the other one. Just, I do like Catwoman. I like the kind of interplay between Batman and Catwoman that goes on, but there's certainly nothing like enough of it to actually save the film. I like watching Christopher Walken, but as I say, he's effectively a minor character in the film, and because so much of it is centered around the Penguin, and Danny DeVito's character just doesn't cut it for me, and I don't like it on that basis. So certainly a step down for the first film. Batman Forever followed 3 years later, and is one of the most annoyingly titled films in my life, because it's very clear that the fourth film in a Batman franchise should be called Batman Forever. It's just so bloody obvious. Shrek
managed it. They had Shrek Forever After as the fourth one.
How do you screw this up? I don't understand. But anyway, New Brooms
all around. Be grateful that they didn't realise at the last moment and call it Batman 3 Ever, because that would probably happen nowadays.
Yeah, Batman 3 After might work, I don't know. At any rate, new brooms all round as Joel Schumacher takes over on direction duties, and Val Kilmer, of all people, slips under the cowl, aided for the first time by Chris O'Donnell's acrobat-turned-vengeance seeker Robin, after Two-Face, played by Tommy Lee Jones, kills his parents in a plan to flush out the Bat's secret identity. With that foiled, Two-Face teams up with Jim Carrey's Riddler, a mad scientist with a grudge against Bruce Wayne, who is busy convincing Gothamites to purchase a new 3D TV, which has the side effect of draining their brain power and feeding it to him. Kilmer's convincing enough, actually, for all that. I think he does actually a pretty decent role as Batman in this film, and his interactions with O'Donnell and new love interest Dr. Chase Meridian, played by Nicole Kidman, are all well done, but the side is rather let down by the bad guys. The action's decent enough, and let's be honest, it's actually much better than anything that happened in the last two films due to the redesign of a suit so that people can actually move in it. But the continual Carey gurning combined with the continual Jones gurning is just grating. Also, while we're told repeatedly of Two-Face's split personality, I don't think it's actually once ever shown, and instead it's just lots of shouting. When I watched this again a couple of weeks back, it is actually, I have to admit, more enjoyable than I remembered it being, but it's still pretty damn bad. There's some joy to be had from Kilmer's performance. I think it's surprisingly competent. The action's okay, but Jim Carrey Tommy Lee Jones chewing far too much of the scenery for me to really get behind. Still not the low watermark in the franchise, but still doing a pretty damn good job of getting down there.
Yeah, it's a pity. I really like Tommy Lee Jones, and I think you can give him something a bit better to work with, and he's actually going to be a really entertaining bad guy, but you don't get to see him play often. One of the big problems for me with this film, though, is Jim Carrey. Because the problem, you have to ask yourself in any Jim Carrey film 2 questions. 1, is Jim Carrey in it? Yes. Okay. Not necessarily a bad thing yet. In this film, is Jim Carrey Jim Carrey? If the answer is yes, don't watch it. Unfortunately, in this, he's very much Jim Carrey. And it's the gurney, it just drives me crazy. It's why I've never got on with him. It's frustrating, Jim Carrey, because when you have a director who can actually rein him in, even if it's something when he's a bit Jim Carrey, like in Bruce Almighty, if there's any sort of restraint at all, it becomes a bit more watchable. Proper restraint, like in Man on the Moon, he's actually good. But in this, no, he's basically just, you've got Joel Schumacher, who either thinks what he's doing is the right thing for the film or is completely unable to control Jim Carrey. And this is just after Ace Ventura, isn't it? So it's when Jim Carrey was really big, and sort of probably harder to control. And he's just, every time I just think about this film, all I can think about is just him gurning and gurning and gurning to the point where I can almost remember nothing else about it. And it's not a good thing to remember. The
film does get 1 bonus star for having our boy Don the Dragon Wilson in it, as he commands his bizarre army of neon-clad ninjas, which Robin tries to beat up. But yeah, other than having Don the Dragon Wilson in it, not worth digging out. We'll shift down. down, deeper and down. Batman and Robin, a few years later, 1997, Schumacher's back again, and he continually shifts the tone into all-out cartoon for this follow-up. We're following Arnold Schwarzenegger as he dons a ton of makeup and prosthetics as he becomes Mr. Freeze, a scientist who put his beloved terminally ill wife into cryosleep until he can perfect a cure, which is one of the more interesting villain backstories, but any interest in this is quickly wasted into turning him into another one-liner spewing diamond thief, which he needs to power his gadgets. He soon enough teams up with Uma Thurman's Poison Ivy, who's another corrupted scientist who's now able to control vegetation and wants to destroy humanity and give plants their day in the sun. It's up to Batman and Robin to stop them, and this time round they're also aided by Alicia Silverstone as Alfred's niece, who steps in as Batgirl. Chris O'Donnell returns, and he's still perfectly acceptable in his role. However, Batman has been recast as George Clooney. George Clooney? Really? Much as I like the guy, he's wildly miscast here, and he doesn't convince in the slightest as either Batman or Bruce Wayne. Doesn't convince at all. Gotham has been given a strange, wild neon infusion, which clashes terribly with the expected atmosphere, and the plot's occasional attempt at drama is undermined by the continual horrible puns. Thurman perhaps escapes from this best in the femme fatale role, and again, the large action sequences are largely okay, but it's still pretty much a career low for everyone involved. I can't bring myself to hate it quite as much as I used to. I did a review of this back in our one-liner days, and when I read back I was surprised at how much vitriol I was able to muster for, well, anything on celluloid actually, but yeah, I can't hate it as much as I used to, but still, it is the worst film we will talk about here. It is the least rewarding way to spend 2 hours that we'll talk about in this episode, and yes, I heartily recommend that everyone just forget about it.
Batman and Robin I have in fact avoided, so if I've taken your advice, I've sent it back to myself in the past because I've never seen it and don't particularly want to. And I like George Clooney a great deal, but even then, when I only really knew George Clooney from ER, it's like, George Clooney as Batman? Really? Really? It's a very strange one. It does sound like a few missed opportunities though, because actually Mr. Freeze with the sort of being corrupted because he was just like desperate to find a cure for his wife, actually that is an interesting idea for a villain. But then you're saying it just becomes like it's like, oh, Arnie's famous for one-liners, let's make him do lots of silly one-liners then. Yes,
it is very quickly forgotten about, and then you just have him going on, ha, eyes to see you, ha, and assorted such things. Not good.
Right, it seems that by the 4th film of both of the Superman and Batman franchises, they had entirely lost their way. There was a break of almost a decade, and then I think with probably as a response to things like Spider-Man starting up in some of the Marvel and the X-Men and the Marvel properties began to get popular, I think DC and Warner Bros. Decided to dip their toe back into the water again. and start bringing their iconic characters back to the big screen. So Superman and Batman were getting geared up to come back. For Superman though, rather than reboot entirely, they decided to make more or less a fifth film in the series that had begun with Christopher Reeve. Christopher Reeve, of course, at this point had his spinal injury, and I think possibly was even dead by the time Superman Returns was released. But it follows on more or less from what is like a continuation of the character. So now I think at the time, and I actually thought you'd felt the same, Scott, because I'm sure I remember this conversation, that Superman Returns was like more or less okay, but kind of felt in some ways like the 1978 Superman again.
Yeah.
And I had some hope for it too, because it was directed by Bryan Singer, whose two X-Men films I'd liked a great deal. And obviously with his The Usual Suspects, one of my all-time favourite films, I thought, yep, Superman probably in pretty safe hands here. And I watched it again just yesterday too, and it's very meh. It's not something that really stands up to rewatching again. Now, I think, Scott, to you, unlike me, watched this back to back with Superman 4, so maybe that makes it look better than it might otherwise have been in contrast.
Yeah, nothing like that to force a reappraisal of your memory. There's obviously a huge gulf in both talent and production value behind both, but yeah, it's not without its problems. Yeah,
so yeah, actually not without its problems. Structurally and narratively, well, a little slippery. Because it's trying to be a sequel to Superman 2, I think it's largely trying to forget Superman 4. It's sort of trying to be a reboot, but there's too much continuity of character, and there's no way that Brandon Routh is not styled to try and look as much like Christopher Reeve as they possibly can. I think possibly you could argue that doing a straight up reboot may have been the better thing to do. Well, let's talk a wee bit about the film first. As the title implies, Superman Returns because some astronomers have apparently found the remains of Krypton, and they just gloss over the fact that it took Superman thousands of years as a baby to get to Earth because it was so far away, but within 5 years he's there and back. Okay. Science is not the strong point of a Superman film, so perhaps forgive it that. But he's flown away to the remains of Krypton to see if anything or anybody is left. And when he comes back, he finds that the world has not, in fact, gone to pot, as you might have expected. It's sort of carried on. It's like, oh, Superman, I think I remember him. And particularly this is the case with Lois Lane, who has won a Pulitzer Prize for writing a piece called Superman, Why the World Doesn't Need Him. Not that she's bitter at all about him leaving. So when he returns to work at the Daily Planet as Clark Kent, he finds that Lois is married to Daily Planet worker Richard White, the nephew of the editor Perry White, and has spawned a young boy, as he discovers by kind of becoming a stalker rather than the paragon of virtue he's supposed to be. There's not much time to unpick that dynamic, however, as a recently released from prison Lex Luthor, played here by Kevin Spacey, has discovered or rediscovered, yes, this bit threw me slightly because he's been there before but had to look for it again, the Fortress of Solitude, and stolen some of the magical sea monkey Krypton crystals. And is planning on using them to create a new continent because apparently basing one film around real estate wasn't enough. Decided that it would base this film around real estate again, and apparently creating this new continent will sink North America. Okay, so a bit like the first film on steroids. It's not a bad film. It's, on watching it again, I would have to say it's pretty mediocre though. The special effects for a film that's only 10 years ago don't stand up anything like as well as the film from 20 years before it. Mm-hmm. I think because it's so obviously CGI, and that has in so many times been shown to age so very badly.
Yeah.
With the 1978 film, you could see that, yes, the special effects weren't particularly sophisticated, but you can clearly see here is a person. You can see there's a real person doing the real things.
Yeah.
The older, when you CGI, you just see it's like, yeah, it's the CGI cartoon. You kind of just lose interest in it. It does try to take a bit of a darker tone, and so yeah, but it sort of fits nicely with the take at the same time it was happening with Christopher Nolan's Batman series. It's a bit mediocre. I think Scott, you would say to me that you describe it as a bit flat. Mm-hmm. There's no real chemistry between any of the leads, and Brandon Routh's nowhere near as compelling a performer as Reeve. I think not that Brandon Routh isn't capable of a decent performance. Not that I've seen him much since Zack and Mary Make a Porno, but in that Kevin Smith film, he's actually funny for the small amount that he's in it. Here, I think they cast him more because he looked a bit like Christopher Reeve than for any other reason, which is a pretty weak casting decision.
Yeah.
And he's just nowhere near as compelling as Reeve. He just didn't have any of Christopher Reeve's charisma. Maybe one of the things that's worth watching is Kevin Spacey chewing scenery, which I didn't like to see that much, but sort of fits in with the way Gene Hackman took on the role. There's not a great deal of energy on screen, and the story itself is entirely forgettable. So when something remarkable happens, it feels rather ordinary. And maybe saying that lifting an entire continent should feel ordinary says quite a lot about how lacking in motivation the film seems. It's just, I was going to say bland, but I don't think that's quite the word. It's just, it feels, on rewatching it a decade later, uninspired.
Yeah.
It's not a bad film. It's got reasonably high production values. Some of the special effects haven't aged well. At the time, they were probably fantastic, cutting edge. It's just that there's no zing about it. There's nothing from the characters they're saying. There's nothing to mark it out as a Bryan Singer directed film. Kevin Spacey, who is in so many things so great, kind of wasted here. But there's nothing bad about it. It's not Superman 4. But it's just a film that's just like Superman Returns. Probably saw that once, and then you never think about it again.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to the tone. It's never quite been cracked how you can try and lever the tone of a Batman film, especially with how dark that franchise got with what Superman seems to be best at. One's dark, one's bright, and trying to make them two into the same film has really just been an exercise in trying to make Superman as dark as possible, and I don't think it really works all that well, and that nut's not been cracked to this day, which we'll get on to later on. All that said, I thought Superman Returns is fine. As I say, I could take it or leave it when I watched it in the first instance when it was released, and I've not really thought about it until a couple of weeks back, so I suppose I left it. But as I say, touched on earlier, when you watch this back to back with Superman 4, it's clearly miles ahead of that. But there's just not a lot of charisma, there's not a lot of heart on screen. It's a perfectly competent film in what it's doing. I think even, I'm not so concerned about the CG even. I think it's all fine. It's a fine film, but it's very difficult to get excited about it because no one on screen seems to be particularly excited about it. I think a lot of people did criticise this when it came out as going, oh, nothing happens in this film, and that's not the case. Lots of things do happen in it. As we say, Superman lifts a small continent. It is very big things happening in it, but it just doesn't feel like an event somehow.
The word has occurred to me. It lacks enthusiasm. Yeah. From all involved. And the problem too for me that I'm just thinking about a wee bit more now is that I thought about this before in the past. Superman for me is a bit boring. It's kind of hard for his character not to be, because he's a god. There's no genuine way to get any real peril for him. And then the only way they can weaken him is, how are we going to make Superman fun? Oh, kryptonite. Again? Well, kryptonite. Oh, okay. Carry on. Kryptonite it is then. Which is why I think, or at least one of the reasons why, for me, Superman 2 is the best, because in that case, he becomes vulnerable in a much more interesting way because he has someone of equal, possibly even greater power than him. Yeah. Someone of his own species is like a genuine rival, and that's where the danger comes in. That's where the weakness and vulnerability of Superman comes in. It's right, this makes sense, and it's not some silly crystal again, and it's obviously, it's a Superman film and Superman's going to win, but because there's an actual equal match to him, it's right, okay, where does this go? Whereas in every other film, it's well, he's a god, and what can you possibly care about them happening? There's nothing that can hurt him. Yeah. And I think Superman Returns suffers from that same sort of thing again, because it's kryptonite again, is it? Okay. Yeah. Great. Yeah, kind of by the very nature of his power, Superman is essentially writing himself into a corner in every film that he's in. So that is a problem with it. So between it just being a bit flat, and I think I've never quite got behind how it's sort of a sequel, sort of isn't kind of thing. It's like it's trying to have its cake and eat it, because there's points that it doesn't make a lot of sense, like Spacey having to continually trying to re-find
Forces of Solitude, and then kind of say, hey, have you been here before? And then it's almost like turn to the camera and wink. It doesn't seem to have its own story straight. It can't decide whether Superman's a proper all-American superhero or if he's someone that goes around stalking people with his superpowers, which is weird. It can't decide whether it's properly a sequel or if it's kind of a sequel or if it's trying to be a reboot and not quite nailing it. Narratively, I think it's trying to be much more complicated than it really needed to be, and all that just kind of got in the way of telling the actual story you want to do. And I think you could. Do you really need to show Superman's origin story in these kind of things, which is something we'll probably talk about in Man of Steel later? Surely you can just assume that knowledge and just go into the proper story and not have to kind of fiddle around the edges with it.
And it does a sort of, I was going to say Star Wars, it's nothing like Islam, but it begins with an opening, like on-screen text with saying, where Superman's been. And so it's assuming at that point that you know who Superman is, but then still feels the need to add in a flashback for his origin story again.
Yeah.
It's quite mixed in that it doesn't seem to know what it's doing with itself, so as well as a lack of enthusiasm, it does seem to have a bit of a lack of direction. It doesn't seem to, it's a bit all over the place.
Right, so jumping back a year chronologically, 2005 brought us Batman Begins, which is another descriptive title. It covers, as it does, the kickoff of the Nolan-flavoured Christian Bale starring Batman universe. Well, we've not really mentioned it. I suppose we should cover it. Batman's origin story, of course. Bruce Wayne is orphaned as a child after a random bucking goes wrong, leaving him with a burning need for justice/vengeance. After determining that he's not going to be able to do much against crime as a young rich kid, when he comes of age, he eventually goes off around the world in a quest to understand and beat up the criminal elements in society, eventually coming to the attention of Ra's al Ghul's League of Shadows, which I believe is a particularly hard-fought pub football league. Through the power of amateur soccer, they teach Wayne the secrets of the ninja and general badassery, but Wayne leaves in dramatic bridge-burning style when they inform him of their plan to destroy Gotham, as it has become an unsalvageable den of scum and villainy. Bruce, however, is convinced that it can be saved, so he dons the Batsuit along with other Wayne Industries prototype military equipment and goes to work on the mob, meeting with some success. At least that is until the League shows up for revenge and a spot of light Gotham destroying via Scarecrow's powerful psycho gas. Well, there's a number of great elements in Nolan's stints. I think the one that stands out to me most in Batman Begins, and probably should be mentioned first, we could treat all of the three Nolan films as one and kind of talk amongst them, but we'll split them up a little bit. But for me, what stands out most in the first installment is Bale's outstanding performance. It's compelling enough even to make his silly Batman voice convincing. And also the tone Nolan's created is also remarkable. It's not exactly realistic in the Dogma 95 sense, but it's as close as you could feasibly expect for a film. And crucially, his choice to use practical effects wherever possible, despite the seeming impossibility of many of them, has given this film and all the following films a real heft that reliance on CG cannot provide, just as we were talking about there with Superman Returns. As a result, Batman Begins looks as convincing today as it did a decade ago, and you can't say that of the likes of, Superman Returns or King Kong or any of these other event sort of driven CG showreels. Batman Begins still looks absolutely fantastic to this day. Absolutely hugely compelling action scenes, all feel really impactful and pack a real punch. Probably goes without saying for that. And spoilers, all of Chris Nolan's Batman films are brilliant, and certainly Batman Begins is an incredibly strong start to the franchise. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just I'm going to respond first to your point about the effects too. It does help a lot. Again, it's why I think the 1978 Superman effect is still a bit, is because, yes, the front projection, it does look a bit dodgy, and it's just a man lying on a table while wind blows at him, but you can see that it's a man there. There's a human being there, and it makes so much difference. And even at the time, King Kong looked awful to me. I really thought it looked horrible because it was just lots of CGI, and it did not look appealing at all. It's obviously something Christopher Nolan particularly likes. It clearly came to its zenith in Inception with that incredible fight in the elevator and the weightless section, with all the walls turning over. But it started off in Batman Begins really, and followed it through this whole Batman series, and it makes such a difference. And it grounds it again, as you say. It's not realistic in the way that this could actually happen, that as much as that you could like, believe this could happen, but it comes as close to it as you can while still having it be a superhero, I think. And it's one of the reasons I find it so compelling. Yes, Christian Bale's voice is much derided and it's a bit silly, but at the same time you've got to think, well, he is trying to make himself not appear like to be Bruce Wayne. So maybe disguising his voice might be a smart idea too. You know, he blacks up around the eyes, he changes his voice, he covers himself in a mask, and unlike, you know, Clark Kent, who's clearly Superman with his hair brushed differently, you could believe that this is a different person. So that's actually there's a reason for the voice.
Yeah,
and it's like they do other, almost, I think, I don't know whether conscious or not, but I was thinking this when you mentioned earlier, Scott, about how Michael Keaton couldn't move in his batsuit. Yeah. They go to pains in the Batman Begins, or films Begins, Batman Begins, to show you how they designed the batsuit and even like mention about movement and be able to turn his head and things.
Yeah.
Possibly as a response to the fact that Michael Keaton looks so stiff in his batsuit. But it's so close to being grounded in reality, and it's actually why I found, and I don't read comic books, so I don't really know how they are in the original source material, but it's why, certainly as a filmic character, I find Batman far and away the most interesting superhero, because like the conflict in him and that too, but that he's not a magic person.
Yeah.
He's a capable, intelligent, well-financed human being who's using technology and skill and determination and things like that to do these things. And the villains, for the most part, in Batman Begins and The Dark Knight Rises, are also human beings. You know, in the comic books, Ra's al Ghul can be resurrected, etc. There's no suggestion of that in Batman Begins. So it's, again, everything is so much closer to being grounded in reality, and it makes it much easier to engage with, I find, too. And maybe like the magic stuff that's been put into the water supply is a bit comic book, but still it's a bit better than, you know, trying to create a new continent from a bit of crystal and then lifting it out of the sea. Yeah.
There's still a patina of believability about that, and I think that really does help it. Yeah. And as you're saying about the effects, I mean, you can only imagine the production meetings where he goes, how can we conceivably, you know, convincingly make this Batmobile drive across the top of some roofs? I know, let's build a Batmobile and some roofs and drive one across the other. Yes. Planning on a kind of scale that we've not really seen before in a lot of things. Films like this, and it really does help make it a special film. And yeah, the tone, we've criticised some of the Superman films for going darker in tone, but of course the dark tone really helps Batman's character. It's what he's about. Yeah. You know, he's clearly someone who's conflicted and beaten up and in a bad place psychologically, and that kind of plays into the kind of tone that's created in the darkness of the film, and that does help, I think, bring out a lot of the conflict in the Batman character, and really helps make him a more interesting protagonist, certainly than someone like Superman, who's basically got no bothers about anything until we throw some green lumps at him.
Because because he's not magic in any way or a mutant or anything, he's a human. There is nothing inherently special about him, other than he's got this determination and he's got some skill which he can work on, and he has a lot of money. But he's a human being, which makes the peril more real. It makes the stakes more interesting. And then you also, I think actually Batman Begins compared to the subsequent two suffers a little in that some of the scenes, particularly at night in Arkham, have that feeling of being on a soundstage or looking a bit not real, whereas the subsequent films mostly feel like they're in real locations.
Yeah.
Batman Begins still has a fair bit of that. It doesn't rely on CG and it being centered with like real humans in real places, and everything just feels so much more grounded, and it just makes it a much, much more compelling film. Not just a superhero film, just like a genuinely good film. And I know lots of people who don't, for instance, my parents, etc., don't really like superhero stuff or anything like that. And because this is so not superhero in the way that like an X-Men film or something is, really, really like this. And there's a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, again, I remember reviewing one of these films, I think it was Batman Returns, but it applies to all of them, that compared to all the rest of the films that were kicking about at the time, this made all of them feel rather silly. Even the good ones, even like what would have been high watermarks at the time, things like perhaps Spider-Man or X-Men.
Spider-Man 2, I think, maybe at that time,
And much as I still like those films, they feel like silly comic book movies in a way that this doesn't, even though it's clearly it is a silly comic book movie, but it doesn't feel like that at all, because it treats its subject with far more respect, and his actually gives them a kind of character arc that they could work off, and gives actors something to do, which is when you get an actor as good as Christian Bale inside the role, good things happen.
Yeah, I mean, then you should have, so Christian Bale, all three of us at Fudge and Film are big fans of Christian Bale and always have been. He's great. Then you have Michael Caine, who's fantastic, and he's only a supporting character in this, but I think it's among his role as Alfred's among the best things he's ever done.
Yeah,
because there's a genuine chemistry between him and Christian Bale.
Yeah,
he's a character with sympathy but also humor, and you genuinely believe that he cares about Bruce Wayne. So it all works together. You have really good writing, you have great practical effects, you have good settings, good cinematography, solid direction, excellent direction. Then you have just character motivation and enthusiastic and good actors too.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some bits that possibly I would change in Batman Begins. I don't rate Katie Holmes much, although this is possibly the best thing she's ever done. Maggie Gyllenhaal, who replaced her in The Dark Knight, is a much stronger actor.
Yeah.
Maybe the only real beef I have acting-wise in Batman Begins is Tom Wilkinson, because for some reason, again, people keep casting Tom Wilkinson in roles where he has to do an accent, and he can't do accents.
Yeah.
This is possibly not his fault then, it's actually the casting director or something. But other than that, yeah, everything is it's so well cast, so well written, so well acted, so well directed. And it's just, again, you can't just say it in terms of comic book films. It's just a genuinely very, very good film. A genuinely excellent film.
Yeah, you don't need to just put on the scale the way you have to do with in my opinion, most of the Marvel films, for example. It is just a really great film.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All three of the Nolan films, I would say, like I think you said too, Scott, you consider them excellent as films, not as superhero movies or anything like that, as films.
In my opinion, the strongest films of each year they came out. It's, for my money, the best trilogy of films that there's been.
Yeah, I would. Yep. I can't think of anything stronger as a trilogy than the Christopher Nolan Batman films. Unsurprisingly, this was a comic book film that had a sequel. In this case, legitimately so, because Batman Begins was A, very, very successful, and B, really, really good. So 3 years later, we return with the same cast, same director, same quality, quite frankly, for The Dark Knight. Now, this is a few years into Batman's campaign against organised crime in Gotham. The mob bosses are on the run, and citizens of Gotham appear to have rediscovered some hope, particularly the District Attorney Harvey Dent, played here by Aaron Eckhart. There does seem, however, to have been a bit of a response to Batman's upping of the ante in the form of Heath Ledger's Joker, the iconic villain of the Batman franchise, who was teased at the end of Batman Begins. And, I'm going to stop for a moment just to also praise Gary Oldman in the Batman Begins. I should have mentioned him. Again, he's somebody else very capable of chewing the scenery like a lunatic, but with the exception probably of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, I think his role as Commissioner Gordon's the role of his lifetime. And it's just like everybody is just in such good form in this trilogy. That aside over, the Joker has arisen, and he goes on a spree of crime and violence aimed at bringing down the Bat, but also showing that there's corruption in Gotham's people itself. He seems to have set himself on showing that Harvey Dent can be corrupted. This leads to Batman taking the fall for Dent's crimes as Dent loses his marvels after the love of his life is killed, and he becomes the horrific Two-Face. The strengths of Batman Begins are still evident, but the show is stolen by Heath Ledger's Oscar-winning and Oscar-worthy performance as the Joker. Redolent with menace, strange tics, and a general otherworldly psychopathic charm. And for me, worlds apart from Jack Nicholson's Joker, but also substantially better. Although perhaps it's not really fair to compare them because they are so very different in tone.
Yeah.
But Ledger alone would be worth the price of admission. So the supporting cast continued to be excellent. Gary Oldman I've mentioned, Michael Caine I mentioned earlier. Maggie Gyllenhaal replaces Katie Holmes. She's a stronger actor, and she's really, really interesting as Rachel, and in the love triangle between Harvey Dent and Bruce Wayne. She feels like she's actually an active participant and isn't just what might happen in a lesser film of it being the woman that's up to be won by the two men. She feels like a genuine character in that actually has a role in it for herself rather than being a prize. It's generally regarded as a high point in the series. To me, it is. But again, why rank them when A, you want to watch them all anyway, and that they're all so good. It's a bit of a futile exercise. It's just a film where everything, again, like Batman Begins, just seems to work very, very well. It's just so well made.
Yeah.
I really have pretty much nothing negative to say about this film at all. Even when it was sort of handicapped a little by Heath Ledger's premature death and them not having had all the material they might have wanted from him, you can't tell. It's so well crafted that you can't really tell those things.
Yeah, it's just a wonderful film. Really enjoy it. I'm gonna go on and praise Heath Ledger an awful lot, but as just wanted to reiterate what Drew said, it is one of the most well casted films. The whole, all of the franchises, but all the actors are really showing up on the right game. As you mentioned, Gary Oldman and Michael Caine, they're all doing really great stuff. Even Cillian Murphy is terrific as a Scarecrow in the last film. So I won't batter on about that too much, but Heath Ledger is just fantastic. Just the portrayal of the Joker is it's just so great. I can't really say enough about it. All these little weird tics he's got, the occasional kind of that way he kind of licks his lips every now and again and just sticking his tongue out. The magic trick, of course, of making the pencil disappear is obviously the obvious headliner to go for, which was such an incredibly impactful moment. It's so simple. All these other little things that you kind of notice when you watch it a few times, as I have, the way that he almost never actually looks at anyone he shoots, things like that. He's always like pointing his gun, running away from people as though it's of no consequence to him whatsoever. All these lovely little bits, and a lot of which were, of course, improvised. Heath Ledger famously threw himself into this role, locking himself up in hotels for fortnights at a time to kind of perfect the laugh that he would have. Other little character tricks that have written for him, things like the way he, as he puts it, if he's going to have a past, he'd rather it be multiple choice, and how he's kind of seemingly just contemporaneously sort of whiffing out these origin stories for himself that kind of keeps you guessing what is this guy doing, what's his motivation, and you never really get a handle on it. The closest, I guess, is Alfred's summation of some people just want to see the world burn. What a tremendously enjoyable character, and the sort of he's admittedly doing the sort of things you wouldn't really want to be admitted to being entertained by, but it's just handled so well. Can't say enough about his performance. It makes what would be an otherwise pretty good film absolutely something special,
compelling.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there are, I think, there've been a number of different Jokers over the years, but I think there are three really iconic ones that are the ones worth mentioning. There's Mark Hamill's Joker in particularly the Arkham video games and the animated television series that has its fans in it. Mark Hamill, when he's playing a Joker, clearly having an absolute hoot, very entertaining. There's Jack Nicholson Joker, beloved by many, although for me he's the third place of these two. But then there's Heath Ledger's Joker, which is just head and shoulders above anything else.
Yeah.
An absolutely fantastic performance in a really, really well written role that looks like he's having a lot of fun with it, not in the same way that, say, Mark Hamill does. His Joker is deeply entertaining because Mark Hamill's having a hoot doing it. Heath Ledger's is more restrained than that. The interaction between him and Christian Bale, like for instance in the scenes when he's being interrogated in that room where they're locked in together, it's a fantastic role. It's such a good villain. And honestly, cause you can't keep them because they are so different in tone, but I think it's probably even considerably better than Terrence Stamp's Zod.
Yeah.
Comparing these two. But it's such a good one. It's just, obviously, the biggest pity for him being dead is that, he's dead and he had the family and friends and things, but it would have been nice to see that character come back or do something else. But this Dark Knight, probably the high point of the trilogy, but I don't really want to divide them much. I love them all and we'll watch them all repeatedly. Everything about it and the franchise in general, series in general, is just spot on. I know we keep saying this, but it's true. The casting's so good and the action and the direction, everything seems so well honed. And it's even just like objectively to see something done so well is a nice thing.
Indeed. So we round the trilogy off in 2012 with The Dark Knight Rises. It's set some year later. Batman's still seen as a villain, but he hasn't needed to put the cape on for a while. The laws that have been inspired by the mythology of Harvey Dent's unimpeached character has swept criminals into jail by the boatload, and a beaten up, broken down Bruce Wayne has withdrawn himself from the world into a wing of his mansion. He is, however, prompted to rejoin the world a little when someone who turns out to be Catwoman, played by Anne Hathaway, seems to be stealing his family jewels. Who are Mrs.? But she's actually just after his fingerprints for use in the film's main antagonist's plan. That being Bane, played by Tom Hardy, who is described as a mercenary, but before long he's unveiling himself as the leader of a resurgent League of Shadows, although his backstory and relationship to Ra's al Ghul is a little more complicated than that. Bane's on a quest to finish what Raz started, firstly by breaking Batman's back and throwing him in a deep dark prison, and then by holding Gotham hostage with a fusion bomb, trying to blow Gotham up after he instigates a reign of anarchy and suffering under the guise of this being a redistribution of power to the common people. Who will stop him? Well, Batman, though obviously, sorry for the spoilers. While I guess the general feeling is that this is the weakest of the three films, I feel that using the word weak anywhere near this trilogy is entirely wrong-headed, as I think the thing that really stands out, I won't go over things like the effects work and all that stuff, but it's just as good as it has been in all the other films, perhaps better. Again, a practical effect that involves actually destroying a plane, just because then you can see that someone has actually destroyed a plane. It deserves a lot of credit, but that's as strong as it ever has been. But I think the thing that stands out most for me in Dark Knight Rises is the way that it completes Batman's arc as a character, how he's gone from needing vengeance to kind of broken down, and then finally finding some redemption at the end. And I think that makes it one of the best and most satisfying conclusions to any kind of superhero film that we've seen. When it gets to the end, it does feel quite emotional. It does feel like he's gone on a journey and gets there. And if you can sit through Michael Caine's, I think I've seen this film about 5 times now, but if you can sit through Michael Caine's speech at the end, talking about how he's failed, without tearing up, then there's something wrong with you. I think you may have had your emotions severed or something like that.
I think you're broken as a human being if you can resist at least the feeling of a tear in your eye at that point.
Yeah. So I don't suppose we need to spend too much time on it. It's got all of the same strengths as the other films have for me, and it really is just a great trilogy of films, and this is just as good. And of course, it means that I can do Bane impersonations now and again, which makes it, of course, fantastic for everyone, not just me.
Yeah, you mentioned, Scott, that it's been described as the weakest. Well, that's, I would say, least brilliant rather than weakest to put it in context. You mentioned Bane's voice. That's like Christian Bale's Batman voice. It's another thing that's been much derided.
But it's brilliant. Perhaps, it's really great. I love Bane's voice. I don't know why people hate it. I love Bane's
voice too. But in this case, I think maybe it's the one that's more legitimate, because whereas with Batman, Christian Bale is modifying his voice, with Bane, it's the one thing that's sort of sits slightly apart from the rest of the things of being in place when the voice is clearly coming from. It's not like there in that time, but I really like the voice, so it's fine for me. But it's a criticism of this that I will not disagree with. If people don't like the voice, that's fine. I get that for this, but for me, it's great. The other thing too, you mentioned like it coming to the end of the story arc. It really does. The character arc finishes, and it makes sense. It fits. It feels good, and also while you could maybe cynically suggest that with the transferring of the handing of the mantle over to Joseph Gordon-Levitt at the end of the film, that's like setting up for a sequel. Genuinely, to me, it doesn't feel that way. It just feels like, right, the world, or Gotham at least, needs Batman. It's not going to be Bruce Wayne anymore. It's going to be this other guy. And that fits with the story and character arc. And it's not setting up for a sequel. It's just that the character, the legend must continue. And that's what Bruce Wayne has put in place. And it feels neat to me in a way that other films that feel like deliberately set up for a sequel don't. It really doesn't feel like that to me. Just the whole thing is from beginning to end, from Batman Begins in 2005 to The Dark Knight Rises 2012. The whole thing seems well thought out, well crafted. And it just feels complete and satisfying in a way that few trilogies can be. Yeah,
in a way, I'm glad that the whole DC universe thing that they were trying to kick off with Superman Returns didn't work out here, because it would, I think, unavoidably have messed with the ending of this film, and would have made the whole trilogy weaker just by kind of, it probably would have to have petered out somewhat by then and still have Batman running around in some form with Bruce Wayne. And I think it's much stronger to actually just kind of tie his arc up in a bow and then start fresh with some new things later on. So yeah, I think it turned out to be the right decision, even if it was one that was more forced upon them than actually made for dramatic reasons. It's such a great trilogy of films, and yeah, if for some reason you've got this far and haven't seen all these Batman films, then go, what are you doing with yourself? Go off and watch them immediately and come back to us and thank us later.
So after the success of the Batman trilogy and Christopher Nolan in particular. And with DC and Warner Brothers casting envious eyes over Marvel's direction, they did want to begin their own cinematic universe, this time not based on Superman Returns. They decided to reboot Superman. So in 2013 we got Man of Steel. So Superman Returns had been released to more or less widespread apathy. So with it being overseen creatively by Christopher Nolan, Watchmen's Zack Snyder was at the helm, and Englishman Henry Cavill donned the cape for the all-American hero. Although this time a decent chunk of the film was devoted to Russell Crowe's Jor-El back on Krypton, after the ruling council ignored Jor-El's warning that the planet is about to explode, because apparently there's only one scientist who could work this out in an advanced race of super beings, but let's not dwell on that too long. A faction of the army under General Zod, played by Michael Shannon, attempts a coup. While this fails, seeing them banished, there's no stopping the planet's destruction, and all Jor-El can do is fire off his son to Earth in the same way that Marlon Brando did in 1978. He's then raised by Kevin Costner's Jonathan and Diane Lane's Martha Kent, instructed by a sensibly paranoid Jonathan to keep his superpowers hidden, to the extent of rather pointlessly sacrificing himself in a sneak tornado attack rather than allow his son to save him. That does seem a quite weak reason for Clark to go off on a journey of self-discovery. Like, sort of looking back, doesn't seem any less silly now than it did 2 years ago, or 3 years ago rather. So the soon-to-be Superman goes away for a while trying to find himself, travels around the United States, works on a fishing boat, etc., saves enough people to leave an urban legend trail for enterprising journalists to later follow, before getting wind of what turns out to be an old, crashed Kryptonian scout ship that fires off a number of plot strands. It puts Lois Lane on his trail and reveals to Clark details of his past, and it puts Clark and Earth on the radar of General Zod and the surviving surviving Krypton militia. So at this point, Clark decides to adopt the persona of Superman, the Superman that we know and love, just in time for Zod and his squad to show up and cause a ruckus. And they're looking to terraform the Earth, or cryptoform the Earth, I guess, really, because it's already terraformed. It's Earth, it's Terra. It's something that's a bit more like Krypton, and kill off all us little Earthlings in the process. So somebody better stop him, and well, there's obviously only one person that can be. Now, like most of Zack Snyder's films, it's divisive, to say the least. It takes the usual Superman mythos in a few different directions, which wasn't universally well received. It's much darker in tone than the Christopher Reeve outing, certainly. Arguably, more so than Christopher Nolan's Batman's, and it doesn't contain any of the wisecracks or inappropriate moments of levity that, for some reason, the Marvel cinematic deluge has trained audiences to expect, which could make it a little po-faced, actually. It could possibly do. It doesn't need comedy, but it maybe needs humour. To leaven it slightly.
Certainly, I mean, if you compare this to the Batman films, there's another kind of levity that you get. It's not forced levity or anything, but there's a certain camaraderie between guys like, say, Christian Bale and Michael Caine, which could leaven the tone just the right amount in places, without feeling like it's just sort of like a joke shoehorned in for it. It feels like kind of natural. Yeah,
there are some very subtle things in the Batman films too. The notable one is in The Dark Knight Rises, and it's to do, I think it's a distinction that's, for me, not subtle at all, but for too many people, a bit subtle, like the distinction between humour and wit and comedy.
Yeah.
And the Nolan films have bits of wit and humour, and the notable one is when Catwoman disappears off the roof when Batman turns his head in The Dark Knight Rises, and he says, "Oh, that's what that feels like." And Man of Steel sorely is in need of even just a few bits like that here and there, because it's very, very po-faced.
Yeah.
Superman himself is presented with much tougher moral choices to challenge his code of conduct, and I think a lot of people didn't want to be challenged about the actual logistics of what happens when conflict on that scale occurs. But biggest problem is possibly the amount of CG required for the city-wrecking climax, and I've said this before in other Fudge and Film podcasts and back in the one-liner, just when something ends up, and I think you're the same, Scott, something ends up in a big CGI thud fest, and it's like big CGI monsters knocking 7 bells at each other, it's all just the CGI. I just switch off completely.
Yeah, it's got to the point where we've seen that so many times It just feels like character swaps by this point. It's now just a Mortal Kombat game occurring, and I've seen it enough times that I don't really need to see it anymore. So I'll start thinking about something more interesting at that point.
I mean, the idea of, like, because it's what I mentioned, it's so good in Superman 2. You've got Superman and Zod fighting each other, whereas, like, Superman's got a genuine rival there. Something that's probably stronger than him is an experienced military commander, whereas Superman was raised by humans. That's, it's interesting. There's actual peril there. Mm-hmm. But it's such a big scale at the end, and it's CGI thing, punch to CGI thing. Yeah, it ends now, and then it seems to like last 4 hours.
I totally understand why they wrote it this way, but it just couldn't bring it out. I mean, it needs something spectacular and world-threatening to actually give Superman a challenge because he is Superman. Again, it's just this whole writing itself into a corner thing. I see where they were going with this, but I don't think it quite managed to pull it off. What I've always thought would be more interesting is if when, say, Zod punches Superman, rather than have him fly off through cities and stuff, right, you can have these spaceships going about crashing all over the place and such like, which if you want to get your CG spectacular, do that. But then rather when it's a fight between Superman and Zod, don't have them fling each other through buildings and such. To have that just become a normal fist fight.
Exactly what I was going to say too, because if Superman punched, say, a human, apart from maybe it'd probably disintegrate, maybe he'd send them back far enough, but if they're people who are reasonably evenly matched, well then there's going to be like two humans fighting each other, surely. And I think it would be a more satisfying ending for me anyway. Say you accept the terror or the Krypton farming going on around them, in Metropolis, and the big CJ things with the spaceships, etc. But just them in the middle on a human scale, more or less, just brawling, grazed knuckles and bloody noses and things. I think that would actually be a much more interesting, a bit of Bourne-style hand-to-hand combat or something like that. Something, what's the word I'm looking for? I used the word brutal already.
Visceral, my favourite.
Visceral, that's exactly the word I'm looking for, Scott. Thank you. Something more visceral, just with the two actors there, I think would have been a much more compelling climax.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see hints that they kind of understand this, because, I mean, how it ends is unarguably the best bit, where it is really just them in a bear hug at the end, and leading up to the discussion, spoilers if you've not seen this already, but where Superman decides to do something which he wouldn't normally do, actually kills Zod. He breaks his neck, because it's clear that there is no way to stop him other than doing that. And this is kind of where I touched on earlier about them, challenging the code of conduct. A lot of people really didn't like that. I thought it was one of the most interesting things the film did, and could have went to a number of very interesting places in the films after it. It kind of didn't, as it turns out, but I still think that is making the characters do something interesting that we've not done before is what we should be doing with these kind of characters. I mean, we've seen Superman up 10 times before, but might as well do something a bit different with him, and it did to an extent, but it never quite followed through with it, and the things that are around it just were a bit too flat to really sustain the interest over the whole film.
Yeah, it's flat is a good word. It's lacking some real emotional peaks, and even some action peaks. It just the idea of like it was a criticism I had at the time, a few people had, and other people argued, it doesn't happen, but it does, is that Superman's supposed to want to protect everybody, and there's no way that people weren't being killed in that fight at the end. Oh no, they got everybody out. Well, no, it's a city with millions of people that's being bombarded and things. People must have got hurt. And it's potentially, if they could have followed on with that Superman realises that his actions in stopping Zod have actually caused people to die. That's an interesting way to take the character after that, is maybe the repercussions of that on him, what he does, how he reacts to things. That could actually be genuinely interesting, because while physically Superman's invulnerable and that's dull, if you start looking at more the psychological side of it, I think that could be a pretty compelling way to take it. It's like vulnerable mentally.
Yes.
Works, because you can't make him vulnerable physically without using those silly crystals again, and that's really dull. For me, a bit of a missed opportunity, because there are hints of things that are there, and Kevin Costner is watchable in this. There's some good performances. Amy Adams is pretty watchable, and Henry Cavill, he's got sort of an air about him that seems to fit the role quite well.
I think he's well cast. I buy him as Superman in a way that I never bought Brandon Routh as Superman. He just kind of immediately looks like the part.
He's no Christopher Reeve. I think Christopher Reeve just got that role really well. It just seemed to work. But yeah, Henry Cavill, I do buy as Superman. Casting wise, so I'll let you finish in just a moment. I just wanted to mention once more. Casting wise, for me, the big disappointment though was Michael Shannon. Again, was thinking about how memorable Terrence Stamp's Zod was. I am a really big Michael Shannon fan. I think he's fantastic, and you see him in stuff like a film we saw a few years ago, a small film at the Edinburgh Film Festival. They get much release elsewhere, called The Missing Person. He's fantastic in that. He's fantastic as Nelson in Boardwalk Empire. Michael Shannon, though, as a military commander stroke action hero, well, action villain, didn't work for me. He seemed so out of place, and I think that's a large part of why I found this film so disappointing.
Yeah, I probably liked him a little more than you in this role. I thought he was okay, but it's maybe less anything that he does, as the role itself just doesn't quite pull off what it needs to do. It's another one of these things. I absolutely see where they're going with it. They've cast Zod as someone who was only ever doing what he wanted to do with his fanatical inbred desire to protect Krypton. And that makes sense, and this is kind of why I liked some of the bits on Krypton earlier as well, because it dives more into that society and how everyone's bred for a purpose, and that there's not been any natural births. Superman's the first natural birth in, well, I can't remember what it said, hundreds of years or whatever, and so he's bred this way. There's not really anything that Zod can do to change his personality and what his actions. And there's lots of interesting aspects there, but it doesn't capitalise on it. He just becomes another grunting bad guy towards the end of it and just screams about how he wants revenge upon Superman for some reason. Again, I see where they're going with lots of elements in this. I mean, there's lots of these elements that I find quite intriguing about Man of Steel. I think there's a film in here that is really good, but what they've actually made is kind of covering up most of the good bits and produce something that's, it's certainly not a bad film, but it's not much above mediocre.
It's a missed opportunity because there are some really tantalising moments here that's like stuff that, at least on the big screen, I don't know for the comics, but at least on the big screen, you've not seen Superman tested in quite this way, and it's not done the same things with the characters. And I just want them to grab that and go with it, because that's the interesting stuff, and it seems to be what they've largely avoided in the end.
At least some of it does get paid forward into the recent release, which is the reason we're doing this podcast. Just cluttering up multiplexes around you will be Batman vs Superman. Zack Snyder following on from Man of Steel and finally hitting that crossover goal that DC and Warner Brothers have been trying to reach for, I believe, at least something like 20 years. There's a separate podcast about failed projects that never got started that would be interesting to do one day if we could work out a way to do it. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting backstory we've kind of covered with, which, if nothing else, gave us that wonderful scene of Nick Cage in the Superman outfit, which is worth looking up if you haven't seen that already. So Henry Cavill returns as Superman. He's now revealed to the world after the carnage at the end of the last film, and largely seen as a protector, a guardian and a saviour, with all the connotations that the last word entails. The unveiling of superpowered aliens has caused some concern, particularly amongst Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, who's rather more Zuckerbergian in character in this incarnation, and Affleck's Bruce Batman Wayne, who witnesses the downsides of being collateral damage in a battle between gods when Zod and Superman casually wipe out one of his office towers, including a lot of his employees. This film doesn't shy away from the fact that a lot of people died in Metropolis as a result of that battle. Unfortunately, it's rather using that to look into the people it affected rather than Superman itself, which is perhaps one of my biggest disappointments with the film. At any rate, Luthor starts pulling some strings, and before long, Batman and Superman are on a collision course, which leads to the headline fight, which, of course, then leads to them coming to an understanding to join up and face an even greater threat, as the subtitle implies, with the dawn of justice, as Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman also joins the Proto-Justice League for the final showdown, as we find out that there are indeed other highly powered metahumans knocking about, as this film single-handedly attempts to create a DC universe to rival the likes of Marvel's. And that is probably the film's biggest structural flaw, as there's a few very notable occasions where it slows right down to show off something that's not going to be paid off in this film. It's almost certainly not going to be paid off later in this year with Suicide Squad. And if these touches had been rather lighter, it may have helped trim off some fat from the running time. Particularly, there's an effectively told but almost entirely entirely tangential couple of sequences where Bruce Wayne is imagining or dreaming or perhaps viewing an alternate universe. It's a bit hard to say, where Superman is a tyrannical dictator. But the only other bone I've really got to pick with it is the all too common reliance of superhero films to wind up with CG actors thumping CG monsters as a climax, which I've seen too much of to care about at this point. Again, not really that Batman vs Superman CG is worse than any others, but there's none of the heft to it as you saw with Nolan's films and their practical effects. So that's really the same criticism as we had with Man of Steel. Did you see this, Drew?
I've not seen it yet, unfortunately. I'm not going to get a chance to see it until tomorrow.
Okay, so I know there's one thing you'll be particularly fond of when there's some big silly CG monster towards the end of it, and do you know what the first thing he does is?
Oh, please tell me it doesn't turn to the camera and roar.
Well, that's exactly what he does. However could you predict that? Yeah, so
I hate that so much.
Yeah, so my main feeling on Batman vs Superman, and there's obviously been an awful lot of negative reaction to this film already, but for me, this is 2 hours of a film that I think works really, really well, and was one of the most enjoyable 2 hours I've had in watching a comic book film in some time. And then there's half an hour of it which isn't really very good at all, and unfortunately it's the last half hour that leaves a bit of a sore note in the mouth as you leave the cinema. But lots of things work really well. Jesse Eisenberg and in particular Ben Affleck, two casting choices that were questioned in the same way that I guess George Clooney's was back in the day, but they both work really, really well. And if it wasn't for Christian Bale, Ben Affleck would be the best Batman there has been. It's also particularly interesting to join a Batman at the tail end of his career, and the nods to this version's history add a real intrigue to his character. Things like padding past a display cabinet that's got a set of his Batsuit that the Joker's graffitied on. Things like that, which prompt lots of questions that we'd really like to actually see what happened to Batman in this universe that they've created. Also positive, the titular fight between Batman and Superman is great, and also a later dismantling of some of Lex Luthor's goons is, well, both combined are two of the best Batman fights yet seen, and in particular the latter of the two mentioned, which eschews the more, hesitate to say it, grounded combat, say, of Nolan's Batman film. Not that it's hugely realistic, but you could imagine something like a Batman fight scene from Batman Begins or such, like showing up in a Jet Li film, for example, without it being too much out of place. The fights in this one are closer to perhaps the Arkham Asylum and City games, where Batman's wielding all these gadgets that he's got. He fires off gadgets that disable guns. People are getting battered around by grappling hooks and thrown around. It's a really great, fun fight. It's a real change of pace for the film, although you probably wouldn't want to watch a film full of it. That would become, I think, a bit tiring. That does bring me to another perceived flaw, I think, rather than an actual flaw. I think it's a strength. Rather like Zack Snyder's Watchmen, it is not wall-to-wall action, which perhaps it's kind of sold on. Even the title would imply it. But while the fight scenes and action scenes that are there are really good, apart from the ending, which you'll get to, there are lots of moments of introspection at the internal lives and motivations of the protagonists, and it does take them as seriously as Nolan took his characters seriously. And unfortunately, it does seem that people have become conditioned by Marvel's output to expect nice, bright colours and breezy banter, and all of that is distinctly lacking in BVS. But for my money, that makes it a more remarkable and a better film than its competition, but of course your mileage may vary. I certainly think that, much like Man of Steel, it could use a few moments of the wit that is just as absent from this as another one. There's very few moments of levity, and the few ones that are there you've seen in the trailers. There's not a lot of wit here. It's all very straight-laced, which it could do perhaps with maybe cutting loose on a few occasions. The only real bit of joy you can see is perhaps from Jesse Eisenberg's performance, which is wonderfully unhinged. So in a general sense, Batman vs Superman combines the aesthetic of Man of Steel with elements of the thematic content of Watchmen, but both of course were very divisive films, so on some level I can understand why this has met a similar fate. But rather like my opinion on both of those films, I can't quite get my head around why you wouldn't at least like it on some level. The action's not constant, but when it shows up, it's all the more impactful from it, and it does treat its characters as actual characters rather than spandex-clad kung fu monkeys. So yes, Batman vs Superman isn't as good as Nolan's works, to be sure, but it's leagues ahead of most of the identical Marvel output, and I think really does not deserve the bad press that it gets. Of course, the bad press has not diminished it in the slightest, at least on its first weekend. It's had a tremendously successful opening weekend, the most successful kind of Easter opening I think there has been. The interesting thing, I guess, will be to show off how next week's results come in, whether there's been a huge drop-off about word of mouth. But I mean, I think the general sense is that audiences quite like it, even if critics don't. In this instance, I am more on the audience's side than the critics.
I'm quite intrigued about the fight, though, because that's one of the things I've seen the most negative talk about, is that so many people seem to think that the Superman-Batman fight is a massive anticlimax.
I just thought it was really cleverly done. Again, the standard issue of how do you defeat Superman. Well, you have to be cleverer than him. Superman's not really around for his brain, so that's why Wayne's... He develops the tools and develops the traps to get rid of him. Yeah. There's a bit of narm towards the end of it where they kind of realise that they have a common goal, which is a little bit tenuous, but I can forgive it that because the last 5 minutes before it were just so good.
Actually, a lot of people seem to think it's quite an anticlimax, but I'm thinking that from what you're saying about it so far, it might be sort of more my sort of thing. Again, like more towards the visceral brawl that I mentioned earlier for the end of Man of Steel instead of the massive CGI thump fest I think other people wanted. That sounds much more interesting to me, so I'm quite intrigued to find out what I actually think of that. I
look forward to that. We should maybe do a follow-up on that perhaps in the podcast a bit later on, but yes, I really quite enjoyed it. I can't quite get on board with the trade of hate that this one's building up as well, and I think it does a pretty reasonable job in what it's doing. As I kind of mentioned, it is trying to single-handedly create this universe, and it could really have done without that. I don't really see what spending 10 to 15 minutes of, essentially introductions to the films that they're planning to do in the next 5 years or so. I don't really see why you needed to do them. You could just have done those in the story. I mean, I know you want to try and do the Justice League films next, but there's easier ways to introduce them into that film rather than this one. And I don't think it really helps. I mean, surely having the three characters, your Superman, your Batman, and your Wonder Woman, is enough to get started with, and you could have just left with that. Especially when it's far more intriguing when Wonder Woman essentially just shows up, more or less, and we don't really get to hear a lot of her backstory, and I'm quite interested to hear what that will be, rather than have it try to fairly tenuously try and put it on a computer file as happens in this film, which is just kind of silly. And that just takes up a lot of time that it doesn't need to do. At 2.5 hours, it is too long. It could have done with being at least half an hour chopped out of that, and I think you could have done that quite easily. Especially given that it's not the most quickly paced film in the world. But as I say, I like something occasionally that's a bit more ponderous, a bit more like Watchmen, where it's more about the characters' internal lives and their motivations and how they can be manipulated into doing certain things by people who have bad intent. And I think that, in general, that worked much better than I thought it would do. Certainly, Batman vs Superman, as I say, it's still well below Nolan's output, but I still think it deserves mention alongside it, which is not something that we'll say about too many films, and certainly not too many films that we've covered in this podcast. So it's certainly one of the more interesting takes on both the characters, and I think deserves at least your attention to watch it, even if you do wind up not liking it. I think you will still find that it was at least an interesting experiment to see where they could go with these kind of things. So on that basis, it's worth a trip to the cinema.
Okay then, I think we've been in your ear holes for quite long enough now, talking about Batman and Superman. We will return shortly with a commentary track featuring one of these superheroes, and then our regular schedule will continue after that. If you want to contact us, you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/fudsonfilm. You can find us on Twitter at twitter.com/fudsonfilm. You can email us at podcast@fudsonfilm.com, and you can, if you want, leave us a review on iTunes or SoundCloud or wherever you happen to get your podcasts from. If you have any issues with their podcast, any questions you'd like to ask us, any responses to what we've talked about, we welcome your feedback, and we will otherwise be speaking to you very shortly. So for now, it's goodbye.
Bye-bye.